Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Mary Klook, and I'm the director of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, and I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome you all to the fifth in the series, six-part series, co-hosted by the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation and the Embassy of Austria in South Africa. I'd like to acknowledge and thank my colleagues, Tally Nates from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and Heather Blumenthal from the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center for their hard work and effort in putting this together, and to in particular thank the Ambassador of Austria in South Africa, Ambassador Johann Brieger. He isn't able to be with us this evening and has apologized, but the Deputy Ambassador Oliver Grunbacher is here, and we want to welcome him and say thank you once again for this wonderful collaboration and this very, very important series that has been so enjoyed by so many. I also want to welcome Holocaust survivors who've joined us this evening. It's always such a privilege for us to have Holocaust survivors week after week participating in our webinars. To the many teachers and academics who've joined us, thank you so much for your participation as well. And to the trustees of the three Holocaust centers in South Africa, we so appreciate your interest and the wisdom and the efforts that you put in supporting the centers. The format for this evening is going to be a panel discussion. The panel will be facilitated by Dr. Roni Mikel Arieli, and I will introduce Ronnie. She will introduce the panelists. I will just make one apology, and we're very, very sorry that Koketso Moeti, who was joining us this evening, is not able to. She's had to withdraw because many of her family, her mother, her grandmother, and her brother, who live in the Northwest province, have contracted COVID, and her grandmother is in hospital. So she's gone to the Northwest to support her family, and we certainly wish them all a speedy and full recovery. I'm going to now introduce Roni Mikel Arieli, who is the facilitator for this evening. She will introduce our very esteemed panelists, and she will then take the conversation further from there. Without further ado, I want to just make the point that Ronnie, as she's affectionately known to all of us, and I will call her Ronnie in the introduction, but never forget that she is an esteemed and illustrious academic, has worked closely with the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, and in particular the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. She's a close friend of Tally Nates and has become a friend to all of us. I want to just focus on a few aspects of her truly impressive CV. She holds a PhD in Jewish history and contemporary Jewry from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in Israel. And her first book, titled Remembering the Holocaust in a Racial State, Holocaust Memory in South Africa from Apartheid to Democracy from 1948 to 1994, will be published in early 2022. Roni's the bearer of several awards, and she's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Avraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. That's with the support of the Foundation pour les Mémoires de la Shoah, where she's working on her research project, Jewish Deportees in Mauritius from 1940 to 1945, a history from the margins, a really important history about the Holocaust in the southern tip of Africa, and we so value the research that's being done by Dr. Roni Mikel Arieli and look forward to hearing more about that from her this evening. She's also a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Communication Studies at Ben Gurion University, where she's working on a project which is entitled Remembering the 6 Million on Zoom, Holocaust Education and Commemoration in a Digital-Only World. And I think in this digital platform, I'll stop there and say how privileged we are to have Ronnie facilitate this exceptional panel, Post-Holocaust and Apartheid Memories, Confronting Traumatic Pasts. Thank you so much, Ronnie, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Marie, for this very, very kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. I'll apologize if you hear the baby screaming at the other room. I'm sure that my husband will be able to handle it. I'm very pleased that I was invited to participate in this fascinating event on women's agency during Nazism, and particularly happy to be moderating this important panel on post-Holocaust and apartheid memories confronting traumatic pasts. It is important to know that, as Marie stated, my PhD dissertation focused on Holocaust memory in apartheid South Africa. So, of course, the subject of this panel bears a particular relevance for me. And when I conducted my fieldwork for my dissertation, I noticed that the apartheid still existed in many of the South African archives. In order to locate Black voices, I had to turn to archives outside of South Africa and to trace the itineraries of anti-apartheid activists in order to understand the role played by Holocaust memory in their struggle. It was then that I noticed that even in my effort to decolonize the South African archive, the women's voice remained absent. While women played an active role in the struggle, when we talk about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, we most often think about Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Ahmed Kathrada, Walter Sisulu, and others. This reality is not disconnected with the absence of women's voices in Holocaust research. Women's voices, while indispensable in describing human experiences, was completely missing from Holocaust research until 2 decades ago. Introducing gender into the analysis has broadened the historical narrative and legitimized the introduction of perspectives of the individual. In both the histories of apartheid and the Holocaust, the decolonizing of women's voices added new information about women in the conventional knowledge of the events, proving that the absence of women's voices from the historical narratives had resulted partially in incomplete reconstruction of events and prevented a comprehensive interpretation. Unfortunately, as you all heard, the main aspects of the post-apartheid period will not be presented here today. This is nonetheless why when I was first approached by the organizers of this wonderful event, I was thrilled and honored. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. However, before doing so, I would like to mention some housekeeping rules. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present her topic. We will have 2 wonderful speakers today, not including myself. As said, I will also contribute a short presentation on my own work on Mauritius. After all of the presentations, we will have time for a short Q&A. So please write your questions in the chat so that we will be able to present them during the discussion. So our first speaker is Professor Liat Ster-Livni, an associate professor in the Department of Culture at Sapir Academic College. She also teaches in the Cultural Studies MA program and the Department of Literature, Language, and the Arts at the Open University of Israel. Her research focuses on Holocaust commemoration in Israel from the 40s until the present. It combines Holocaust studies, memory studies, cultural studies, trauma studies, and film studies. She is the author of numerous articles and 5 books. And she is the recipient of the 2019 Young Scholar Award, given jointly by the Association for Israel Studies and the Israel Institute. Professor Livni will speak about her research on women Holocaust survivors in Israeli cinema. Professor Livni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ronnie. So first of all, I think you should bring the baby in and introduce us, not let us just hear, the baby from afar, but this is up to you. If you want to, in the meantime, I can talk. So as Ronnie said, I'm not going to talk about apartheid. I'm just going to share my presentation. You can see it. Ronnie, it's fine. You can see the presentation. Great. So my area of expertise, as Ronnie said, is Holocaust commemoration in Israel from the 40s until the present. And today I'm going to talk about the misrepresentation of violated women, Holocaust survivors, in Israeli fiction films. And I'm going to compare two case studies, one from the 40s and one from the 80s, in order to discuss a very problematic topic regarding the way Israeli cinema deals with the representation of Holocaust survivors. Here you're going to see the two case studies. The first one is a film from 1947 titled My Father's House, and the other one is from 40 years later, from 1987, titled Tel Aviv, Berlin. And of course, I'm going to talk what happened since the 1980s and forward. But in the meantime, for the beginning, I want to say that around 500,000 Holocaust survivors immigrated to Israel up until the 60s. They were met with empathy and an honest attempt to help them. But alongside, there was suspicious, and there were questions like, how come my entire family perished and you survived? And the answers Israelis gave themselves were sometimes problematic. One of the answers Israelis gave themselves is that survivors survived because they did immoral things, quote unquote. When it came to young, pretty women, the situation was even much worse because there was a concept that became an almost fact, of course, not a fact, but this is how Israelis saw it, that if a woman, and if she was young and pretty, survived the Holocaust, she probably used her sexuality, was abused, became a prostitute, and so on. They didn't know anything about numbers, about facts, but this was the common notion. And this common notion also appeared in cinema. Now, Israeli Holocaust awareness changed over the years. From the 1980s, Israeli Holocaust awareness is something completely different. And cinema scholars assert that from the 1980s, the problematic image of women Holocaust survivors in cinema had changed and became much better. And I claim that the opposite had happened. The negative image, the negative sexual image remained and even deepened. And I want to talk about it in my lecture today. So first of all, when I talk about this common knowledge that if you were young and pretty alive, you probably were used or misused sexually, appeared in various aspects of Israeli culture. You could find it, and here are several examples. You could find it in poetry, in literature, in public debates, and in private meetings. I once interviewed a Holocaust survivor, a woman Holocaust survivor. She arrived in Israel when she was a young woman, and she was met again with great empathy. Her aunts loved her and helped her. But one day she told me they took her to the bathroom, they undressed her because they wanted to see if she has a tattoo on her body saying that she was a prostitute or something like that. When they saw that she doesn't have a tattoo, they left her alone, and that was it. I just want to emphasize this because we have to understand that this is a complex situation. It's not a situation in which the Israeli society ignores the Holocaust survivors or shuns away from the Holocaust survivors or just say, listen, if you survive, you probably did bad things or so on. This is a very complex situation which involves empathy and love and a real want to help and very negative stereotypes. And again, it appeared in literature, in prose, and it also appeared in cinema. Now, cinema in the first decades of the state was Zionist cinema, meaning it was produced by the Zionist establishment before the state, and after 1948, it was produced by the state itself, and it propagated Zionist ideas, meaning you can look at it as propaganda films. The main topic was Zionism, and these films were used to propagate Zionist theme, meaning the only place the survivors can heal and change and regain their life is in Israel. This is a political statement, a very important political statement. And within these films, Holocaust survivors were used as a kind of tool to show how powerful Israel is. In these films, various films were produced, but the narrative was very similar. At the beginning of the films, a Holocaust survivor, being it a man or a woman, arrives in Israel. They are broken physically and mentally, and at the end of the film, due to the healing powers of the land and its people, these people become new citizens, new persons, rejuvenated, and so on. When it came to women, they added another character. the women undergo a kind of purification process, meaning they arrive in Israel after they were abused or they were forced to be prostitutes. And here in Israel, they undergo a purification process, becoming pure and modest and so on. And this is when we begin with My Father's House. So you can see here the protagonist. This is Miriam. She's a Holocaust survivor. According to the film, and again, these are fiction films. These are not documentaries. These are all fiction films. They are all actors playing a role. This is Miriam. She arrives in the land of Israel, and she says that when she was in Auschwitz, they let her keep her hair. They didn't shave her hair. This is what she says at the beginning. She doesn't say much about her past, but in one scene, she confesses to Avraham. This is Avraham, he's a native Israeli. She confesses about her part during the Holocaust. She was forced to be a prostitute, and here she shows him the tattoo that says Feldhura. I'm sorry, this is kind of a blurry, but this is a very old film. And she tells that she was forced to be a prostitute, and moreover, she says that not only that she had to be a prostitute, but she says, and again, this is script, many women had to do so as well. Meaning she's not the only one. This is not a specific case, but this is a phenomenon. To highlight it even more, and again, this is a fiction film, the titles at the beginning of the film, these were these films dealt with real life, and they wanted to emphasize it. So the titles at the beginning of the film said, what you're about to see is a documentary of reality, a documentation of reality, turning the films from fiction into some kind of an anthropological evidence about the survivors. Again, just reminding you that up until this day, none of the historians can establish the numbers of women that were sexually abused or were forced to be prostitutes. Of course, we know that women were abused, that the women were abused all over the countries where the Nazis ruled. We don't know the numbers, we don't know the quantity, and of course, we cannot turn it into a phenomenon. And this is what has been done in the early decades. It became a phenomenon. And again, when they discussed this sexual abuse, this is not a Me Too era. They dealt with it in a very, very damaging way. One Holocaust researcher called the women at that time that were subjected to this stereotype damaged goods. This is how people saw them. Again, this is not a Me Too era. This is something completely different. So it's what they took a very complex and very sensitive topic and turned it into some kind of a collective homogeneous entity of women who survived because they were prostitutes of Nazis. Now we're moving forward 40 years. In these 40 years, Israel had changed. Holocaust awareness in Israel had changed. I don't have time to get into it. I've written a lot about it. You can go in my website and read about it. But the Holocaust awareness in Israel indeed changed and became deeper, especially from the 1980s. And the way the first decades of Israel are represented in cinema had changed as well. First of all, the representation of the absorbing society, meaning the Israelis, had completely changed. Those who were sugar-coated in the past and were presented as this kind society that welcomes Holocaust survivors are now represented from the 1980s onward in a very judgmental manner as a cold and cruel society that marginalized the Holocaust survivors, doesn't want to listen to them, and so on. So this had changed tremendously. But what cinema researchers claimed is that because Holocaust awareness changed, cinema had changed as well, and the image of women became much more complex. They were presented much more in a much more sensitive way, and I claim that the opposite is right. The negative image not only remained, but even deepened. And what do I mean? At the end of the films of the first decades, there was a transformation. Again, these were political films. They had to represent transformation. The women undergo a process of purification. By the end of the film, they are all great women, helping others, very pure. Film, they are the directors wanted so society that they completely canceled the transformation process. So the women Holocaust survivors from the beginning of the film till its end remain in the margins. Those who were represented as prostitutes at the beginning remain prostitutes at the end. And moreover, being a sexual deviant is not only something of the past. According to this film, these characteristics permit the present and ruin the lives of the people around them. And Tel Aviv, Berlin is a good example for this phenomenon. You can see here the two protagonists. One is Binyamin, he's a Holocaust survivor. He arrives in Israel in 1948. And this is Gusti. She's an Auschwitz survivor he meets in Israel. He meets her after he marries somebody else. He marries a woman named Leah, who's not a survivor. She arrived in the land of Israel before the Holocaust. Therefore, she is not a survivor. And she is represented as a great mother and wife, and she wants to keep the family together. But then he meets Gusti, and Gusti plays the role of the Lilith. She seduces him, she takes him away from his family, and in the confines of her house, he meets her girlfriend and discovers the way they all survived Auschwitz. And the way they survived Auschwitz, according to the film, is of course through being a prostitute in Auschwitz. Now, these are the girlfriends, they all play cards, and this is Ruth. She begins to play a card game with him in which she unbuttons her shirt and shoves the cards down her shirt. And you see that the girlfriends try to stop her. And when they try to stop her, she bursts out and she says, do you want to hear all about the games we played with them, meaning with the Nazis? And crying that she was only 12, and it is of course very clear that they all survived because they were forced into prostitution in Auschwitz. One very important thing I forgot to say, that women Holocaust survivors in the 1940s and in the 1950s, when they came to Israel, many times because of this rumor that if you are young and pretty, you survived because you were a prostitute, they wore long sleeves because they didn't want people to show the number, to see the number on their hands. And some of them even went and removed the number tattooed in Auschwitz in laser surgeries because they didn't want to be judged in Israel. So we are 40 years afterwards, and we can see that the situation remained. And what happens is that the situation remains the same. They don't undergo some kind of process. From the end, this is who they are. Women, young, pretty women who survived because they were prostitutes. Now, when we compare it to Leah, you see here in the below picture, Leah, which is Binyamin's wife, you can see two female stereotypes, the whore and the saint. Leah is the saint, again, a devoted wife and mother who tries to keep the family together. And in the upper photo, you can see Gusti, the whore, the Lilith, who takes him away from the family and ruins their home. So these are only few examples, but there are many, many more. Over the years, and I've researched more than 70 years of Israeli cinema, there is a misrepresentation of women Holocaust survivors. The sexual negative image remains after the 1980s. It remains until the present. You can also find it in films directed in the new millennium. But alongside, this is not the only negative image that was posted to women Holocaust survivors. In my research, I've discovered that women Holocaust survivors in Israeli cinema are subjected to three main negative stereotypes. It can be the prostitute, or mentally ill, or unfit mother. And at sometimes, one character, you can find the three stereotypes within one character. And the saddest thing is that in more than 70 years of cinema, when I've checked the films that represent women Holocaust survivors, only in 3 films in which the women are the protagonists, they are not subjected to this triple negative imagery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leah, for this really fascinating presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Maria von Laugas, a sociologist, professor for multi-methods social science at the Center for Methods in Social Science at the University of Göttingen. Her research projects are on intergenerational transmission in and family memories of families of resistance fighters against the Nazi regime, as well as of stigmatized and marginalized groupings of victims in Austria and Germany. Her general research fields: collective memory, biography research, visual and verbal practices of memory. Professor von Laugas will share with us her research about female National Socialists. Professor von, the floor is yours. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for your nice introduction. Good evening to all of you, also from my side. For me, it's a good evening. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and also for the wonderful organization of this very interesting lecture series. Because my English is not fluent enough, I would say, I will read my text and do not speak freely today. So it's much more easier for me to keep the 15 minutes I have time. Today, I basically will talk not about the women in during the Nazi society. I will talk about a certain post-war memory on female National Socialists, which to this day significantly influences and structures the family memories of different generations of Austrian families with a Nazi past. Talking about Austria, and not as is more common about Germany, means talking about a country in which many people were perpetrators of Nazi crimes. We know that memory discourses always emerge and take effect in concrete historical and geographical context and have a specific function. In very, very general terms, we can say that in the case of Austria, hegemonic memory discourses in respect of the Nazi period had the function of fending off, and sometimes still have in some fields of the Austrian society, but had the function of fending off responsibility and guilt for murder and persecution. But today I would like to make the picture more nuanced by speaking about how women who were not persecuted are remembered. Women who participated in different ways in the development and stabilization of Nazi society as verbed National Socialists, women who became perpetrators in various ways, who were loyal to the regime and looked away from what was going on around them. In March 1938, Austria was annexed by Germany. The so-called German term is Anschluss. 700,000 Austrians joined the NSDAP after and before 1938. Anti-Semitism had been increasing for decades, and large parts of the population participated in public humiliation of Austrian Jews. It was not long before Austrians became involved in the persecution and killing of Jews and other groupings. Okay, I try to go further with the. Okay, it doesn't. Oh, now it. Oh, that's too. Okay, now it works. After liberation by the Allies on May 8, 1945, a narrative very quickly became established in which Austria was positioned as the first victims of Hitler's tyranny. Historians call this discourse the national victim discourse. Its function was to deny responsibility for Nazi crimes. It enabled Austrian people to regard themselves as victims of Hitler's Germany, and still does so today. With disregard of the Nazi past, it became possible to suppress and conceal the fact that a high number of Austrians were involved in Nazi society and its crimes. The notion of victimhood, for instance, insistence on one's own suffering and concealment of the involvement of Austrians as perpetrators, became not only the central principle of official references to Austrian Nazi pasts, but also a central strategy in people's everyday lives. in the way they talk about the Nazi past and interact with their family members and friends. One can say that the national victim discourse has made the violent acts committed by Austrians disappear. It is a discourse which legitimates silence and forgetting. The central element of this discourse is the distinction it makes between National Socialism and the Second World War. Its main topic is the way people suffered during the Second World War. National Socialism is not mentioned or only hinted at by the use of expressions such as the dark years or faithful years. These are all terms which has the function to cover up the active involvement of Austrians. The discourse makes it possible to consider the Second World War independently of National Socialism, rather than as its logical consequence. The war was an inherent part of the National Socialist worldview and mode thinking. Separating them makes it possible to speak about the horrors of the war, how everyone suffered during the war, and at the same time not to speak about one's own Nazi past, one's own ideological convictions, one's anti-Semitic views, or one's own involvement in Nazi organizations. I have taken time to explain this because an awareness of the historical context and the discursive distinction of Second World War and National Socialism made in Austria can help us to understand the conditions under which contemporary generations remember, and especially the conditions under which the actions of women are remembered who were Nazis, and also who were not persecuted. In the context of the national victim discourse, so if you have this context in mind of victimhood, a specific image of non-persecuted women became established after 1945. Today, if you ask people in Austria and also in Germany, I would say, what image they have in their head when they think of non-persecuted women in the time of National Socialism and the post-war, especially in the post-war period, you will most probably be given the following description: a group of women standing among the ruins of completely destroyed towns, with bricks in their hands or bending down to pick up pieces of rubble. Some of them smile at the camera. You will find some of these images in the Google if you try. I didn't bring one picture with me. This image is a fixed element of the Austrian collective memory. And it has a specific political function. It positions women as people who, after suffering from the Allied bombings, helped to rebuild the nation under conditions of great hardship. And they did it without protesting and without complaining. In the foreground is their suffering during the war and their willingness to sacrifice themselves to rebuild the nation. The fact that these women also had a Nazi past recedes completely into the background. The discursive distinction between National Socialism and the war, Second World War, which is a central feature of the Austrian memory culture, contributes to concealing the Nazi past of many non-persecuted women. At this point, I would like to make a short comment. I do not question that the military conflicts women suffer from violence. From a feminist perspective, this should be double underlined. Here, however, in the context of the Austrian memories, conflict, struggles, I am mainly interested in the function of this suffering in memory discourses, where it is used to legitimate denial of guilt and responsibility. The remarkable thing is that in the 1980s, certain historical events, I cannot discuss them here in detail, led to a modification of the national victim discourse, so that from this time on, the role of the Austrians in Nazi crimes was acknowledged. In 1991, Franz Vranitzky, the Austrian federal chancellor, spoke for the first time of Austria's guilt in this respect. However, and this is very interesting, in 2005, 60 years after the end of the National Socialism, the established image that glorifies the heroic role of women was refreshed and even more perpetuated. In that year, the Austrian parliament passed a law which said that the woman who gave birth to a child in Austria up to 1941 should receive a compensation payment. With this payment, the Austrian government wanted to officially honor women for their special contribution to the rebuilding of Austria. 60 years after the breakdown of the Nazi regime, non-persecuted mothers who sacrificed themselves for the nation, so this was the picture, were thus again positioned as victims in the memory discourse. I speak in this context of the construction of heroized victims, which is effective only because the Nazi past of these women is completely suppressed. Thus, compensation payments were made to women without asking any questions about their involvement in Nazi society and Nazi crimes. If we look beyond the official discourse and consider the academic discourse in Austria and Germany, we see that early feminist studies also tended to position women as the victims of a patriarchal National Socialist society. But in the 1980s, did scholars start showing an interest in the various opportunities open to women for active participation. And first studies of female guards in concentration camps or Nazi welfare workers were published. However, the lives of women who were not active members of Nazi organizations were largely ignored. Today, we know very little about the everyday life and everyday actions of women in the Nazi period. My research on family memories in Austria shows that glorification of the role of the women in the post-war period and suppression of their participation in the Nazi society is what shapes family dialogues and intergenerational interactions. There are two clear aspects. First, the mothers, grandmothers, or great-grandmothers who were involved in National Socialism are remembered as women who had no political views and no political past. They are remembered as people who suffered during the war and endured privations in the post-war years. Second, the fact that the Nazi past of female family members is rarely mentioned or never mentioned means that knowledge of what female family members did in the Nazi period is decreasing from generation to generation. Depoliticization and a slow process of forgetting are important structural elements of the memories of later generations. They can be read as strategies for fending off guilt and responsibility that are still evident in the younger generation today concerning their mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers. Especially the aspect of depoliticization fits the image accepted by society as a whole of the self-sacrificing apolitical women. So this is a very typical stereotype of women in our societies. After 1945, women who had been actively involved in National Socialism retreated to the position of apolitical women. In family dialogues and in conversation with families of the following generations, they gave the impression that they had not been aware of what was going on and that they had no political opinions. So they also talked about themselves in this way. After 1945, the public discourse in respect of women and National Socialism in Austria legitimates this position to this day and makes it difficult to adopt a critical perspective, also for the descendants, which certainly exists, but which is still marginalized. The image of former female Nazis as heroized victims is a hegemonic image in Austria. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. It was really fascinating. And before I will start my own presentation, I just want to check. Liat, are you with us? Okay. So without further ado, I will now
I'm here.
try. Oh, great. So I just wanted to give Liat the chance to answer two questions that were on the chat, because I know that you need to leave early, and then I will present my my own paper. Liat, is it okay?
Of course.
Great. So the first question about stereotypes about women. How does the Orthodox view of mikveh play into the cleansing stereotype, the cleaning stereotype? And the second was, how did the stereotype of prostitutes interact with violence against women in Israel in the 40s to the 80s, from the 40s to the 80s?
Okay, so regarding the first question, my research focused on cinema. And as you know, there was no Orthodox cinema up until the last decades. So the Orthodox didn't deal with it. But I know that they, in their inner dialogues, they did deal with the topics of what's going to happen if a woman was violated and so on. They discussed it within questions that were sent to the rabbis. It was a topic. So it was part of the Orthodox society as well. It just didn't appear in films because there were no Orthodox films by then. Now, I didn't quite understand the second question. If we talk about violence towards women in Israel in general, so yes, feminism didn't exist in Israel up until, I would say, 1960s, 70s. It arrived a bit late to Israel, and the place of women was marginalized in general. It was not only women Holocaust survivors, but women Holocaust survivors, again, they were depicted as these miserable creatures if they didn't fight. And I have to highlight it. Women who were fighters, women who were part of the partisans or the underground or fought in the ghettos and so on, were idolized. It's something completely different. People looked at them as idols, and they wanted to hear them, and they came to listen to their talks and so on. The women I discuss here are women that didn't fight. Women fighters were completely idolized. The women that didn't fight and only again, quotations, survived, were subjected to this suspicion, to these questions. And most of all, of course, women who survived Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was the only place that they received the tattoo. So wherever they went down the street, everybody could know immediately that they are Holocaust survivors. Other women did not go out to the street and shout, "I'm Holocaust survivors." Women who were Auschwitz survivors were in a problem because of the tattoo. And again, unfortunately, many of them wore long sleeves. And I want to mention that Israel is a desert climate. Most of the year it's very hot. But again, many women chose to wear long sleeves in order to hide the number or just take it off by a laser surgery. So again, I would have expected that since feminism had arrived in Israel at some point, this stereotype would change in films. And the image of women in general in Israeli cinema did indeed change from the 1980s onward. You can see much more women, you can see more complex images and so on, and characteristics. But when it comes to women Holocaust survivors, something had remained 40 years ago. It's a huge problem. I cannot say that it was resolved and in later films everything is fine. No, again, unfortunately, even in films that were produced in the last 2 decades, you can find these images. You can find very problematic images of women Holocaust survivors. I think Israeli fiction film, and I want to highlight it as well, not documentary film. In documentary, it's something completely different. This is a whole other world. These are 2 different trajectories of commemoration of the Holocaust. Okay, so please put documentary cinema aside. Fiction film has done tremendously wrong towards women Holocaust survivors up until the present.
Thank you so much. So I'm really happy that we were able to give you the floor, just to give the audience a taste of the discussion with you. And now I would like to share my screen. Don't worry, we will get back to the Q&A, so please write questions in the chat. Okay. So in my current work on the journey of 1,581 Jewish men, women, and children who fled Nazi-controlled Europe, survived the long journey to Haifa, and were then deported by the British Mandate authorities in Palestine to Mauritius, the amount and scope of men voices is distinct. Nevertheless, as I will now present to you, 635 of the deportees to Mauritius were women. Their conditions were worse than the conditions in the men's camp, and their role in everyday life was very meaningful and important. Therefore, in this short presentation, I would like to recover the forgotten history and memory of the Jewish deportation to Mauritius by focusing on the story of one woman, the German Jewish refugee Anna Frank Klein, who had been an established painter in Berlin before the war. After the windows of her family's apartment in Berlin were smashed on the pogrom of November 1938, she managed to send her children to Switzerland, and in the summer of 1940, she boarded a train to Bratislava, Slovakia, and traveled to Palestine aboard the Atlantic. On 9 December 1940, Anna was one of the Jewish refugees who were deported to Mauritius, where she was detained for almost 5 years at the Bobasan camp. Due to her talent, for a short period, she was chosen by the colonial authorities to work as an art teacher in the local high school, where she experienced multiple encounters with the local population on the island. So our little known episode begins when 3 ships, Pacific, Milos, and Atlantic, set sail for a long voyage from Tulsa, Romania, to the port of Haifa in the British Mandate of Palestine, carrying 3,500 Jewish refugees. And these ships were chartered on September 4, 1940, by the Central Office for Jewish Immigration under the leadership of the Austrian Jewish financial advisor Bertolt Stoffer, and with the consent and cooperation of the German authorities. This group of refugees included people from the Jewish communities in Vienna, Prague, Brno, Berlin, Munich, and Danzig, who came from all streams of Judaism and had different affiliations or affinities to Zionism. Due to the 1939 British White Paper, which enforced a strict immigration quota for Jews entering Palestine, the arriving immigrants were transferred to a ship called the Patria to be deported to Mauritius. In a response, the underground military organization of the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine, the Haganah, decided to sabotage the ship, a decision that caused the tragic death of more than 260 Jewish refugees. And at a time, the Atlantic passengers were not yet transferred to the Patria, so they saw the explosion from the deck of the ship, and of course survived. The British authorities permitted the survivors who were on the Patria to remain in Palestine, transferring them to the athlete camp near Haifa. However, the 581 of the Atlantic passengers were kept in a separate section of the athlete camp, and on the morning of December 9, they were violently deported from Athlete and placed on 2 ships to be deported to Mauritius. Among these refugees, as I mentioned, was German Jewish painter Anna Frank Klein, and as said, Anna traveled on the Atlantic, and as she did not really write a diary or a memoir, this paper is actually based on the stories that she told her 2 sons, Vincent and René, as well as on a translation of a recollection written by Renee a few years ago, and some testimonies of others who knew her. What Anna did leave behind was her artwork. During the long journey to Palestine and thereafter during the detention in Mauritius, Anna was busy sketching her surroundings, particularly focusing on portraits of the refugees and of the people of Mauritius. It is through these materials that I seek to tease out her personal story of deportation in order to give a human face to more impersonal historical processes, often addressed as the histories of Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, British imperialism, and World War II. And don't worry, there is also a South African connection coming soon. So the refugees arrived in Mauritius on December 26, 1940, comprising 849 men, 635 women, and 96 children. They were defined by the local colonial authorities as European detainees, and audiences were established to legislate their detention and legal status and to prevent contact between them and the local population, an offense that carried a 2-year prison sentence. The Bobasan prison, the camp was actually a local prison converted into a camp, and the high walls of the central compound ensured the separation between two sections of the camp. The men were accommodated in the prison cells, and the women and children were brought to a compound of specially built huts. The conditions at the women's camp was much worse than in the men camps. So the men got the private cells. Of course, the doors were always open, but it was still a prison. And the women and children had to live together in very crowded huts with very, very problematic sanitation conditions, no running water. Moreover, there was a complete separation between the two camps, with local guards watching the small gate between the two camps 24/7. At first, as I said, segregation was complete, and conditions in camp were very strict, and only from July 1942, married women were allowed to visit their husbands for a few hours a day, and conditions gradually improved until August 1943, where it again became very strict. So in Mauritius, like many of the detainees, Anna suffered from malaria and was hospitalized at a camp hospital 8 times. And in the recollections, Renee, her son, writes that she could not stand the medicine given against malaria and often threw it under her bed when the nurse were not looking. The refugees' poor health was well reflected in the monthly reports issued by the Mauritius Government House to the Secretary of State of the colonies during the first years of detention, which consisted a list of the detainees who died in detention, including their cause of death, age, and nationality. And a close observation of this list revealed that although in most cases the cause of death was typhoid, there were some deaths from malaria, and not a few. And these cases increased as time passed. And though the authorities were able to explain the typhoid outbreak as a result of the poor sanitary conditions on the ships that brought the refugees to Palestine and thereafter to Mauritius, the first cases of malaria were detected in the camp 2 weeks after the refugees arrived on the island, and therefore served as an indication of the lack of proper preventative care provided by the local authorities. This was particularly prevalent in the women camp, as I said, that sanitary conditions were very poor and there were no running waters or infrastructures. Nevertheless, the refugees developed a vibrant cultural, social, and economic life behind prison bars. There were 2 active synagogues, schools and adult education centers, youth movements, theater groups, and a Zionist association, a library, a camp newspaper, a coffee shop, and a soccer team. These activities were made possible mainly, and I promise, the South African connection, so through the materialistic aid provided by the South African Jewish community, who made sure to send clothing, books, and money, as well as kosher food and other gifts for the detainees. Moreover, in late 1941, some of the skilled detainees got temporary permits to work outside of the camp and assisted in the local manufacturers of soap, perfumes, toys, while others were employed as music, art, and language teachers at local primary schools. Anna was one of the detainees who, as I said, received the colonial authorities' special permit to work outside the camp. She was positioned as an art teacher at a local French school. In fact, the only significant research on the deportation to Mauritius was published in 1998 in the book The Mauritian Shekel, written by Geneviève Pritot, a French Mauritian who lived in Germany, but who as a child was a student of Klein in Mauritius. And she wrote in her book, and I quote, "I was just 10 years old when the refugees arrived in Mauritius in December 1940. 18 months later, when the strict detention regimen had been relaxed, school was privileged to have an art teacher, Mars Anna Frank, who came from the camp at Beaubassin. For us, her students, she was Madame Frank. After about a year, her lessons ceased abruptly because the camp was again tightly closed for security reasons. I never saw her again." Marie Clauchouson, a Mauritian French, also recalled Madame Frank from the war days. In an interview conducted with her in January 2019, she remembered how at the end of 1942, when she was 9 years old, her father asked Frank to paint a portrait of her and her sister. And I quote, "We were told that the Jews could now earn their living, earn a little money. And so my father paid Anna to paint our portraits," she stated. And Marie-Claude mentioned that when the Jews arrived in Mauritius, they were at first received with suspicion among the Franco-Mauritian community. And I quote again, "At first, I got the impression that my dad did not like Jews so much, but very vaguely it was just that it was war and not everyone trusted them, the refugees," end of quote. And this recollection of the suspicious attitude towards the arriving refugees is in line with the perception of some figures among the British colonial authorities prior to the deportation, who perceived the Jews deported to Mauritius not as refugees who had escaped persecution, but as possible enemy agents in need of being restrained and detained. The main reason for this suspicious was the active involvement of the National Socialists in Jewish immigration from their territories. And it is safe to assume that such a perception was also prominent on the island itself. However, in 1942, when Anna was hired by Marie-Claude's father to paint the portraits of his two daughters, it was already clear to the local population that the arriving Jews were refugees escaping Nazi-controlled Europe and not enemy agents. While Anna was indeed German, the fact that she received the colonial authorities' permit to work outside of the camp suggested that she would unlikely to pose a danger to the public. It is important to know that the Franco-Mauritian elite was a powerful minority in Mauritius because it retained control over the sugar industry, even under the British Crown, which in turn gained effective cooperation from the powerful minority. And the positioning of Anna and other detainees as teachers in Franco-Mauritian schools was an expression of their in-between status, neither colonized nor colonizers. The refugees were defined as European detainees, and while interned in a prison and treated in a punitive way, they were certainly considered effective for the colonized society because of their European nationality, skills, and characteristics. Interestingly, While Anna was hired to teach and to paint portraits for the European population in Mauritius, in her free time, she mainly focused on drawing portraits of the colonized population on the island. Two of these portraits were sent to me by her granddaughter a few months ago. The first, as you can see, is of a Creole boy, and the second is of an Indo-Pakistani guard. Both portraits are in black and white and resemble the work Anna did while in Europe painting portraits for the orchestra of the Jewish Cultural Association in Berlin. While there is no written or oral testimony regarding Anna's decision to focus on Indian and Creole portraits, it can be interpreted as an act of resistance in which she breaks open the common binaries of the colonial order in Mauritius and puts into the perspective local histories of conflict. As a German Jewish refugee interned in a British detention camp, Anna utilized her own suffering to create a new ground from which to understand both the specificity of Jewish suffering and what it shares with other forms of discrimination. After 1945, Anna returned to Palestine and lived first in Holon, a suburb of Tel Aviv, and since 1970 in Ramat Efal near Ramat Gan. She also continued her work, her artwork after the establishment of the State of Israel, focusing on colored pastels and watercolor portraits, landscapes, and everyday scenes. Her work had rapidly been exhibited in galleries in Israel. She died in July 30, 1977 in Tel Aviv 4 decades later. In 2017, Anna's older son, Vincent, wrote, and I will finish with this quote, "My mother hardly ever spoke about the sojourn in Mauritius. Even when she suffered from relapse of malaria, she suppressed the misery and hardship of that time. At times, however, she remembered somehow proudly her drawing, her instruction, and the attention she received as an artist there. As there were only few, if any, artists amongst her fellow captives, and because of the unhesitant friendliness of the inhabitants, her memory is certainly true. It is possible that the positive feeling predominated. Perhaps it is even of a more general nature to remember selectively the positive in hard times." Thank you. Okay, so we will turn now to the Q&A. And we have a first question for Maria from Tali. Were there any Austrian women perpetrators who were put on trial or beyond trials, women who survived the camp system? Just unmute yourself.
Yes, there were some trials, but very few, and mainly and the most of them were in Germany, not in Austria. So they were part of the big trials in Germany. And in fact, I don't know if there was no trial in Austria for women.
So another question to you, Maria. Could you distinguish or talk about different classes and regions in Austria with regard to the myth on women? For example, working class in Vienna or rural Upper Austria?
Yeah, thank you very much for this important question, because it is important because I cannot say that there are differences between rural areas or urban areas or concerning class, and I think this is an important aspect, because the myth or the discourse, I call it more discourse, constructs women as a homogeneous group. So in the discourse function as a construction of homogeneous groups, and so we don't know very few about differences between the women. I only want to add some point of, on the other side, the image I talked is according to women in towns, so it's more urban area because there where the ruins, etc. It's not concerning the rural areas, I would say. Yeah, but we don't have more information about that.
I actually would like to address a very important remark by Dr. Betty Govindern. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. The discourses of complicity during apartheid at different levels and spaces across the board are relevant to this discussion and worth pondering over. And I agree, and I would like to actually suggest reading Michael Rothberg's new book, The Implicated Subject, who actually address in one or two chapters also address South Africa, and I think it's actually worth thinking about different subject positions, not only in relations to the Holocaust, but in relations to other atrocities, human rights violations, and of course apartheid. So I completely agree. Let's see if we have. Okay. If we have an additional question or anyone from the audience who is interested in saying anything, now is the time. You can write and we can ask to unmute you. Quiet is okay, is good. So Marie, is it over to you?
Sure, thank you,
I actually
Ronnie.
would like to, I'll just thank, the two wonderful speakers before, Maria and Liat, who already left, for really, I think it was very fascinating. Unfortunately, we couldn't have the post-apartheid angle, but it just give us, a taste for more. So
Absolutely.
thank you.
Absolutely a taste for more. Maria, Ronnie, Liat, it was absolutely fascinating. And there's been an enormous amount of comments of that nature in the chat. I was busy typing a question, so I'll ask you, Maria, is there any attempt in the schools in particular, and in the women's education system, to educate civil society about this myth of the role of women and the dangers of perpetuating the misinterpretation of the history, particularly when the role of women?
As far as I know, so I did not research on school books, but as far as I know, women are not really part and not thematized in the school books. It's already now in school books, you have this transformation of the national victim discourse. Sometimes in critical school books, you have this notion of, okay, so there was right after the breakdown of the National Socialism, there was this notion of victimhood and concealment of perpetratorship. But women are still absent, I would say. And not only in school books, I think you have a difference between the official public discourse and the everyday discourse in the family. I think in my research, I always have this difference. In the public discourse, there are also counter discourses which create conflicts with the hegemonic discourse, and where journalists write, okay, also women were perpetrators. So there are more differences, and it's not so homogeneous. But on the level of the everyday life, in the family dialects, there I always find in many families, these, I told you these, okay, my grandmother, she didn't know anything, and so on, and she was very unpolitical, etc., etc. So it's very important, I think, always to say on which level we talk about. And in the school books, I guess they're absent, the women.
Because it's interesting, as I understand in Germany, there is much more of a confrontation by the younger generation of the perpetrators within the previous generations of the family.
Yeah, but that's why, because Germany was always the land of perpetrators.
Yes, I understand.
Austria, this was the land of the victims, from Hitler's Germany.
But
and
it's
so
interesting that
we are later. Maybe the confrontation or the generation start in the 1890s. So with this confrontation, so we are a little bit behind, maybe.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
There's a couple more questions, if I might just address them quickly. There's one from Carolyn. Did Anna Frank make art in Israel after the war? And I know that you've referenced watercolors and so on, and that she was a very popular artist in Israel. So I'll just ask Mary Simmons's question. She wanted to know whether any work was being done in post-traumatic stress disorder in Israel, obviously for Holocaust survivors, I would think. Liat isn't here, but we do know that much later on, in the 80s, certain Amcha, for example, organizations were established, but much later than one would have anticipated. Did you want to comment on that, Ronnie?
I wanted actually to comment on Anna Frank. I'm sure that there was a lot of work being done on post-trauma in Israel, but it's completely not my field, unfortunately. But regarding Anna Frank, what's interesting was, of course, she was an established artist in Israel as well, and her work was exhibited in Israel until the early 70s. But the work that she did in Israel had nothing to do with her past, as if she wanted to just forget. And I think it's really interesting because it tells a lot about the experience and how one cope with it, and the fact that as a scholar dealing with this very neglected episode, I can tell you that the only women voices that I have are of children who were either born on the camp or were deported as children, and not of grown women who were actually deported and told their story afterward. So yeah, it's a very important, I think it's a very important point to make. That she did continue with her art, but nothing regarding Mauritius.
Not reflecting back on that time in her life. It's a conversation we could continue to have for a long time. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Ronnie, for facilitating and for your amazing presentation. And to you, Maria, and in Liat's absence, you've provoked so much awareness and interest in this topic. I'm certain we would like to invite you to come back, please. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
and to the audience, a reminder, Aria will put up on the screen that we have our last session, that we look forward to your participation once again. But to those panelists this evening, thank you so much for a very thought-provoking evening. And to all of you for attending, thank you so much once again. Keep safe, keep well, and see you next time. Aria, if you'd just like to make sure that everybody knows what is next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, Maria. Bye-bye, Ronnie. Thank
Bye.
you so much, everybody. And make sure you save the date for the Holocaust Remembered, the virtual tour of Vienna that Aria is going to be very involved in.